Good morning. Please be seated. When I was in college, my New Testament professor taught me that the gospel according to Luke is all about upending power. Our gospel passage today is a shining example of both that theme and why Luke is my favorite of all four gospels. Let me set the scene for you. It is a Sabbath day. For many Christians today, the Sabbath is understood as a day of attending church and abstaining from many things we might otherwise enjoy partaking in. In short, the Sabbath is a day of restrictions, hopefully in the service of becoming closer to God. The leader of the synagogue would have understood the Sabbath differently. First, both he and Jesus were Jewish, and they would have experienced the Sabbath day as a day of liberation from the typical routine of labor. A day of true rest and time with God was freeing. So, the leader of the synagogue was in the synagogue, exercising his freedom and facilitating a space for others to seek their liberation as well. Next, we have Jesus, who is inhabiting his role as a rabbi and teaching in this same space. The experience that is happening in the synagogue on this Sabbath is not one which Jesus objects to, and in fact, he is actively participating in these practices. Taking time on the Sabbath day to attend to teaching, which is itself a liberatory act, is something that Jesus clearly cares about a lot. So far, we have a leader who is being faithful, and Jesus, who seems to be on board with this expression of faith on the Sabbath. So, what exactly goes wrong here? We have the entrance of a woman who is disabled and suffering. Jesus immediately makes it possible for her to stand up straight. This act of healing literally allows her to have greater range of motion in her body. Jesus uses the language of freedom to describe what he has done for this woman. She is liberated from the bondage that she had been experiencing for 18 long years. Why does the leader of the synagogue object to what Jesus has done? Now, I'll be honest here and confess to you all that this passage always used to bother me. You see, for years, I understood this story to be a warning against religious fundamentalism or the adherence to religious rules for their own sake. But you see, the problem with that interpretation is that it pits Jesus against pious Jewish leaders when he himself was a Jewish man. And it more broadly pits him against the value of strict religious observance. Now, while I may have my own feelings about when and where to bend the rules a little bit, it does make for a fairly messy sermon topic. Follow the 10 Commandments, except when Jesus tells you not to. That would make for a really clear and concise Sunday school lesson for kids. This week, however, I came across a sermon entitled "The Fierce Urgency of Now" by Gina Stewart. Remember when I said that Luke is all about upending power? Gina Stewart begins her sermon with the sentence, "July 4th, 1776, was the day the colonies decided to declare themselves independent of Britain." She goes on to talk about the irony of the United States Declaration of Independence from Britain occurring in the midst of the ongoing enslavement and oppression of African Americans. Stewart powerfully writes, quote, "It is strange because it makes me wonder how one group would seek to liberate itself from oppression, while at the same time holding another group hostage to the same principle from which they sought to be liberated and freed. Have you ever wondered about that? Have you ever wondered how and why the oppressed oppress others? End quote. There is a long history within the full human experience of individuals or groups striving for freedom, then ironically turning to those with intersecting identities and telling them that their freedom can wait. That there is lots of time for them to become free, and that they ought to seek liberation another time. We saw this with the women's suffrage movement in the United States. White women, including leaders Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, sought the freedom to vote for white women, but did not support the black women who were fighting for their right to vote. We saw this again within the civil rights movement of the 1960s. While Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was publicly fighting for the rights of black Americans, Bayard Rustin was fighting from the shadows. Bayard Rustin was a black gay man who organized the famous March on Washington, and he mostly worked behind the scenes because his sexual orientation was seen as a liability, and the movement needed to focus on freedom for black people first. All of these needs deserve to have been met with urgent attention. But some leaders acted as the leader of the synagogue did and pushed for other leaders to come back at another time for their cure. The needs of the women who had been afflicted for 18 years were determined to not be urgent enough for the leader to permit the achieving of her freedom within the same space he was enjoying his already claimed freedom. This is where Jesus comes in, upends power, and draws attention to the dynamics at play. Jesus recognizes the fierce urgency of the woman to be freed now and heals her. When the indignant leader speaks to the crowd, he is reinforcing the notion that freedom for one somehow infringes upon freedom of another. Jesus offers a different path forward. Both the leader and the women can seek and find freedom on the Sabbath day. If an animal can be untied from what binds them in order that they might be given water on the Sabbath, then how can anyone say that it is improper for the woman to be freed from her bondage? You see, the hypocritical error that Jesus warns against in this passage is not that the leader or the crowd are keeping the Sabbath too carefully. Rather, it is the irony of attempting to deny a woman freedom and rest on such a day. The passage ends with Jesus' opponents in shame and the crowd rejoicing. It is not an easy message to hear that you've been acting as a hypocrite. It is even harder, though, to have the hypocrites continuously deny the urgency of your need for liberation while they actively seek their own freedom. I invite you all to pay attention to which roles you are inhabiting and how Jesus might be calling you to use your freedom on this Sabbath day. Amen.